Charlottesville. Unite the Right. Heather Hare. James Alex Fields. James Alex Fields, Heather Hare, Unite the Right, Charlottesville, and let's not forget General Robert E. Lee. These are some of the places, slogans, names, and symbols that have occasioned the panel today in observation of Constitution Day to discuss their meaning and the Jim Crow Monuments controversy, the title of this panel. So I think some people may ask why a panel like this is a symbol for Constitution Day, right? Why should public universities and their faculty comment on this matter, despite that many of the campuses on which they work feature the very statues and or names that helped stoke the controversy in the first place? Right? What does this conversation have to do with the U.S. Constitution? Despite that, the monuments that we will be discussing represent people touted for rebelling against that very Constitution or defending it, depending on your perspective. So we've assembled this panel today to draw these questions and a little more out together at this present historical and political moment that requires, I think, some critical thought on the part of scholars. So I am your moderator, Weston Haywood. I'll now allow the panelists to introduce themselves, after which we will launch into a conversation with a couple of questions, and then we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So.
Yeah, and first, Weston, you mind turning the lamp off? The switch is right there at the panel, control panel, behind the microphone. It says lamp off. It should be on the left side there. Thank you. Okay.
Oh, and let me also say that if you are here as a student for one of the classes, there are sign-in sheets in the back. There's also one for a separate course, the city course. So be mindful of where you're signing so that you are recorded as having attended. Okay.
So I'm Rick Swanson, Department Head of Political Science. I've been here since 2001. And I'm now an honorary Cajun since I married a Cajun woman. and my in-laws are sitting right there. So.
My name is Maria Seeger. I'm an assistant professor in the English department here, and my work focuses mostly on 19th century American literature and African American literature.
I'm Ian Beamish. I'm an assistant professor in the history department, and I study 19th century U.S. history and the history of slavery.
All right, so just to kick everything off, if you guys can let us know what are the origins of these monuments, sort of where do they all come from?
Well, I think a good place to start is exactly with this context. And I think the important thing for us to remember is that as much as these monuments are often labeled Confederate monuments, I think it's more appropriate to have what we have today, the title of Jim Crow monuments, to properly understand the context. So there's something in the order of 1,500 public symbols, monuments to the Confederacy around the nation, most but not all in the southern states. And about 700 of those take the form of statues. And about 37 of those are here in the state of Louisiana. And across the country, the majority of these monuments and public symbols were constructed not in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, but significantly later, at two moments when white supremacy was in peril. In the 1890s through the 1920s, as Jim Crow laws and the increased legal segregation of the South was happening, and a second moment in the 1950s and 60s during the Civil Rights era, as there were new sets of challenges to the racial hierarchy. And these monuments were erected mostly in the South, but were in many ways a national project. They were mass-produced mostly by factories in the North because they were so common, and shipped down here. They were often erected in very public demonstrations, ceremonies. One monument, the closest to us here in Lafayette, erected in 1922, was attended not just by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who funded it and donated it to the city, who said it was, I don't know if I have the exact phrase here, but yeah, it was erected to perpetuate the very best that has been achieved by our great and truly noble Southern race. And everybody in this crowd would have been pretty aware what Southern race meant in 1922. And this was attended by R.L. Mouton, the mayor at the time, by the governor of Louisiana, and by the Catholic bishop of Lafayette. So these were not small affairs. Most of the businesses in the city closed down to erect the monument. So I think it's important for us to recognize the context of these monuments are in Jim Crow, in the Civil Rights era, and as sort of monuments quite clearly to white supremacy more than to the Confederacy itself.
Yeah, I think the main conceit of DeWeston's excellent question is that monuments oftentimes say more about the period in which they were erected than the period that they're trying to remember. And so I think it's super important to keep in mind the historical origins that Ian just gave us the details of.
Yeah, in fact, just to dovetail on what both Ian and again, I've just met Maria for the first time, by the way. I hope to work with her in the future and Ian on some scholarship since our interests overlap. The Alexander Mouton statue in particular, and this was 1922, and this is when lynchings are peaking through all around the South. Jim Crow is in full force. As Ian said, the speaker talked about our noble Southern race, and they didn't mean black folk in that speech that they were talking about. And the governor, when he attended, he came to Lafayette to visit, and within a couple days, he stayed for a few days, and he gave a talk to a local organization. This was reported in what was then called the Lafayette Advertiser, the precursor to the Daily Advertiser. And he boasted about his father and grandfather had been members of the KKK, and he was very proud of that fact. But now he was against the KKK only because they used violence. And the reason he thought that violence wasn't needed anymore is because the KKK had achieved its objectives of achieving white supremacy, and that now the white supremacy can be perpetuated lawfully without the use of violence. So that just adds to the context of that.
All right, so now that we have the historical context laid out for their original the construction of statues, I mean, what do they do now? What is the sort of the cultural, political work they're intending to do now, and sort of what's the point?
I mean, monuments are an expression of power, and they give a very singular view of a historical event. They're meant to consolidate the view, not to give complexity to a view. So the monuments continue in time and space to give a certain view of to consolidate white supremacy and to consolidate a reading of the Civil War in which the Confederacy's cause was noble. Whether or not we agree with that in contemporary culture is the question that's being asked of these monuments, I believe, justifiably asked.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And I think it's also important for us, when we're thinking about the work that monuments do, to think about where they're placed, right? So if we take the example of Lafayette, it's the one we're most familiar with, the Mouton statue was in front of government, and then in 1980, when government moved to LCG, the Lafayette Consolidated Government, the intent was to move the statue with it. And so this is actually the second time Confederate monuments and their moving, if not removal, has been debated in Lafayette, right? In 1980, it was for something very different. The question was whether we preserve it and keep downtown a certain way, or we move it and we send a different message at Lafayette Consolidated Government. And in the end, with the legal involvement of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, it ended up remaining where it is today, kind of appropriately enough, at the intersection of Jefferson and Lee, downtown. And I think, the fact that these monuments are in particular places is no accident. They're erected in places to send messages. It's not the case in Lafayette, thankfully, but you'll see many of them erected right beside courthouses, which sends another pretty clear message about the work that they intend to do.
Yeah, and think of it this way, monuments, if it was on private property, it's just an expression of that individual, or even if it was on some organization's property, it's only an expression of that organization. But the fact that it's on publicly owned property, it's owned by the city, it's on public property, means that it's an expression of what our community says, is that this is what represents our values, this is the person who we hold up, and you have the expression, I put that person on a pedestal. Well, it comes from putting monuments up where you say, we're going to hold that person up as a model to our children. This is a person whose lives and whose values we want to emulate and copy and respect. And so that's the problem, is that it's not just a private expression, but it's a public expression of this is what our community stands for. And that's why a lot of people then have a very serious problem with it, because they say it's not what I stand for, and it's not, and I can speak personally, it's not, the Alfred Mouton statue does not represent myself or anyone I know. I have not spoken to one person, in person, in Lafayette, who says that statue represents them or their values. The only people I see are online, people that claim it represents them.
And I wonder too, Weston, if I can just add, it's worth considering why neo-Nazis and fascists are rallying to defend these statues. If they represent white supremacy to someone, if the groups that purport to believe in white supremacy are rallying to defend them.
I wonder if you can elaborate a little more on that, because one of the points I made earlier was, for some it's going to be seen as traitors to the state. For others, it's defenders of the state. So I wonder if you all can speak to that a little more. What groups are seek to uphold the monuments, and then those who seek to remove them, and then what happens in their removal? Where are they to go, and what does that mean? That, for instance, they're removed from public space as a public expression. But then to what space do they go, and does that mean something different from what they're saying now?
Well, I think Maria got to an interesting point, which is the most common thing, or one of the most common defenses you hear from groups wanting to maintain the monuments as they are, is they don't matter that much, which again is kind of ridiculous if you see how people turn out to defend them in some places. You hear all these kind of things, which are very clearly false, and I think the magnitude of the defense of these makes very clear how important they are, and I think focusing on who's defending them, a list of people who have certainly a view that Alfred Mouton might have been a hero to Louisiana despite historical reality, and I think groups that you might be even less likely to want to be associated with than that.
And it's been suggested that the monuments might be removed and be placed in appropriate historical context in a museum or an archive of some sort, where the year it was erected, the context it was erected in, the celebrations that were held at the statue, the lynchings that were carried out near the statue, all of this context could be given along with the statue, so that we could see it as a historical artifact of its time, not of the time it purports to represent.
Yeah, and there's context in which monuments are intended to be a part of history. In fact, a lot of people aren't aware that Baton Rouge, for example, had a very tall monument of a generic Confederate soldier standing right in downtown Baton Rouge. And when they did sort of this re-landscaping of the downtown, they took down that Confederate statue, and this was a few years ago, before the whole current monument controversy came about. They moved it into the State Museum, which is the old state capitol, and it's there, it's in this room, it's got some plaques beside it that talk about the context of when this statue was erected, and they moved it to a museum, and there was no public controversy at the time. And so it's very easy to be done. And another example is battlefields, Civil War battlefields. And I was just at Gettysburg over the summer, and there's monuments all around the battlefield, both to the Union and the Confederacy. But these monuments are all, it's really part of one big living history museum as you tour around and learn the history. It's not meant to glorify white supremacy or anything like that. These monuments are all part of talking about here's the location of this, this regiment, or this organization, this state, troops. And you might say, well, but didn't the state of Louisiana intend to honor and glorify its soldiers when they built the Louisiana State Memorial? Sure, but again, it's in the context where it's one big living history museum. And that's totally different from the context of a lot of these monuments.
And I would say that's a great example because, unless I'm wrong, I think national parks and places like Gettysburg have actually banned reenacting the Confederacy on their grounds. So they've actually drawn clear lines about what can be monuments we can consider historical and which ones we can see as glorification. And I think also it's important to talk about one of the other common criticisms that we get, which is that you're erasing history. And I think often the response to you're erasing history is no, we're just resituating history in a museum, but it's maybe a little more controversial, but I think you should embrace that you're erasing history and rewriting history. Because the history that you're erasing and rewriting is an incorrect history. It's one that's not based on historical reality, and it's a narrative that was reconstructed from the start in the 1920s, the 19-teens, as part of what historians call the lost cause, where the history of the Confederacy was rewritten from being about slavery to being a mythical defense of romanticized agricultural lifestyle. So to me, I think it's perfectly fine to be rewriting history if the history shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Well, yeah, and I think because I think we need to be clear, the history, these Confederate monuments were already part of erasing history. It was part of that lost cause movement. Some of you, I recognize, were here in the earlier hour when I talked about that they were an attempt by Southern whites to literally erase a lot of the history and rewrite it, a completely fictional history. These monuments were part of that. So by moving the monuments to the museum, all you're doing is saying we're going to end fictional history and tell accurate, honest history. And also to dovetail with what you just said, one of the main arguments is, well, you're erasing history. Well, how is putting a statue in a museum where you're going to tell more history, erasing history? Not telling less history, you'll be telling more history than just a minimalist inscription on the base. So you could have an entire room this size with a few monuments and all kinds of plaques on the wall talking about the lost cause movement and all about the history of slavery and secession, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow. That's telling way more history than a monument can do. So it's the opposite. It's not erasing history, it's telling history.
And I think one way to just re-put what Ian and Rick have so nicely said is that there's a real difference between history and cultural memory, or between history and memorialization. They're not the same thing. History is a discipline, a field of contestation, where we're noticing new patterns and where new evidence is unveiled and new arguments are being made. Memorializations, the intent of memorialization is to collapse complexity, to tell a singular narrative that privileges a singular point of view. It is not history. It's a representation of a historical moment, but it is not history itself, the field of history.
So to that point, glad you said that. I have some comments I want to read from some famous tweets from President Trump. In the days that followed the events in Charlottesville. So on August 17th at 8:07 a.m., the President said, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments." 8 minutes later, "You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson, so foolish." 6 minutes later, "Also, the beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced." So I wonder, is President Trump right that the removal of Confederate statues can lead to the removal of other statues like Washington, Jefferson, who represent certain parts of the American story, but not others?
Well, I would suggest that in the current moment, the opposition to statues of Lee, of Jackson, are fundamentally different from criticisms one might level at monuments to Jefferson or Washington. Because right now, most of the criticism of Confederate statues has been framed very much that way. That there's a push to take them down because they're statues to people who, as Dr. Haywood put, in one perspective, participated in a rebellion against the United States. People, and just as importantly as the Confederate nature of the monuments, that were erected during these Jim Crow and civil rights periods with the express purpose and intent of upholding white racial hierarchy. And I think the difference between that and statues to Washington and statues to Jefferson is less who they're a statue of and what the purpose of the statue is, right? Most of the statues to Jefferson and to Washington are statues to their contributions to the nation as presidents rather than as slaveholders. The context of the Washington Monument is very different from the context of a Confederate statue on town squares across the South. So while there might be debates at some point, who knows, about monuments to slaveholders, I think right now there's a fundamental distinction between monuments that emphasize and are there for the purpose of memorializing them as Confederates, as white supremacists, as slaveholders, versus monuments to people who were slaveholders, but the statues memorialize a different aspect of their public life.
Yeah, your question raised so many points that I could respond to. If we say that we can never erect a monument to any flawed human being, then there could be no more monuments or statues ever, because we're all flawed. But at some point you got to say, well, despite the person's flaws, we're still going to honor them for the positive things they did. And so I think there's a huge distinction between honoring Jefferson and Washington specifically for founding a nation, at least that, if not that it practiced liberty and equality perfectly, which it didn't, but at least establishing the concepts of liberty and equality. And those statues in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere don't honor them specifically saying Jefferson the great slave owner or Washington the great slave owner, whereas some monuments specifically are honoring people for their fight for the Confederacy, which specifically was, and I have two handouts, by the way, on a table, if you want to pick them up afterwards, all the quotes from Confederate leaders saying the Civil War was about slavery and they were fighting to keep people enslaved. So it's different than saying we're going to honor someone specifically for their fight for a government whose sole purpose they themselves said was to keep 4 million people enslaved. And so you have to make that distinction. And in fact, we did right at the start of the Revolutionary War, we tore down the statue of King George. Back when the City Council of Lafayette a year ago had a discussion about Alfred Mouton, one gentleman said it's un-American to tear down statues. Well, it was actually very American because we said, King George doesn't represent us anymore, and we tore it down. And so if the public says the Confederacy doesn't represent us anymore, well, then we can tear that down.
I have two small points. The first point is I think there's a difference in the rhetorical and performative displays of white power that occur around Confederate statues versus statues of people like Washington